Days after leading Washington in the national title game against Michigan, Huskies coach Kalen DeBoer is off to Tuscaloosa to become the new Alabama head coach. So what does first-year Washington Athletic Director Troy Dannen do to replace him? That's the big question in Seattle right now. And there is a potentially easy solution for this, and there's a little bit harder solution for this. So let's start with the potentially easy solution for this. There is a guy on Kalen DeBoer's staff who could potentially fill the role. Ryan Grubb, the longtime offensive coordinator who's worked under Kalen DeBoer at multiple stops along the way, would seem to provide a lot of continuity for the Huskies. And Grubb obviously was a huge part of the success that Washington had these last 2 years. He worked with Michael Penix Jr., called those plays. He actually interviewed for Alabama's OC opening last year, but wound up staying at Washington. So if Dannen would like to keep some of what DeBoer was doing intact, I imagine he's going to try to take some people to Alabama as well, then Grubb may be the choice. The other piece of this is because Kalen DeBoer is going somewhere that he has not worked before, where he may need to hire assistants who are more familiar recruiting in the SEC, there's a chance that more of the Washington staff could wind up being left behind. So if you did promote Grubb, you could get quite a bit of continuity compared to what most of these situations work out like. So if that's what Dannen wants to do, I would imagine that the staff and the organization could look fairly similar if he decides to promote Grubb. If he decides to go outside, let's look at Dannen's last hire. Now, Dannen was the Tulane AD. The last hire he made in football was Willie Fritz. And when he hired Willie Fritz, one of the things he liked about Fritz was that he had won at multiple levels. He had won at Division II, at FCS, and in the Group of Five. His most recent stop had been Georgia Southern. He'd been at Sam Houston State before that. So Troy Dannen liked the fact that he was a proven winner at multiple levels. Where there's a few guys in college football right now working in power conference programs that fit that bill. Remember, that was also Kalen DeBoer, who had won an NAIA national title at Sioux Falls. So got a couple guys who would sound very similar to Kalen DeBoer or Willie Fritz in terms of resume. We'll start with Lance Leipold at Kansas. So DeBoer was dominating at NAIA level in his late 20s. Well, in his 30s and 40s, Lance Leipold was dominating Division III. He won 6 Division III national titles at Wisconsin Whitewater, then took over the Buffalo program, and now is currently working miracles at Kansas. Remember, he took over an absolute laughingstock at Kansas and took it over like the last day of spring practice in 2021. Made them competitive quickly, and now they are very competitive. Beat Oklahoma last year, made a bowl game for the second year in a row, and he's basically working miracles there. It's an incredible, incredible story what he's done at Kansas. And this is a guy that I think can win anywhere. But he's also not the only guy in the state of Kansas who fits that bill. Chris Klieman, the Kansas State coach, very similar thing. 4 FCS national titles at North Dakota State, and then he takes over for Bill Snyder at Kansas State and has done a remarkable job there. He won the Big 12 in 2022. And you say, okay, these are developmental guys. Can they recruit? Well, Chris Klieman, he's got a 5-star quarterback on his roster now, Avery Johnson, who's an in-state guy, and he made sure he got him. Highest rated recruit in Kansas State history. He's going to be the starting quarterback for the Wildcats next year now that Will Howard has moved on to Ohio State. So if you think about Klieman, yes, he can develop, but clearly he can also recruit when you have that local 5-star, that local talent, and you need to keep him. And that's something that Washington would like to be able to do. I mean, one of the other pieces of news on Friday was that JT Tuimoloau, the edge rusher at Ohio State, is coming back for another season for the Buckeyes. That's a guy from Seattle that Washington would have loved to get. So got to be able to get those guys too. Klieman can do both, can recruit like that and develop players who are a little more hidden gem under the radar. I think the coach at Washington needs to be good at both of those things because this is a program that can get some of those super highly ranked recruits, but is going to have to make its bones, especially on the line of scrimmage, developing talent. Another guy who's done really well after taking over an incredibly awful roster situation, Jedd Fisch at Arizona. He'd been a career assistant in the NFL and in the college ranks, and he's worked everywhere. So there's not really a region you would tie Jedd Fisch to. He has been the offense coordinator at Michigan and Miami. He has worked for the Texans, the Vikings, the Patriots. He worked for 8 different NFL teams. So he's one that you don't really peg to a region, but you look at what he's done in Arizona. And when he was hired there, nobody knew what he'd be as a head coach. It was kind of a mystery. But the job he's done has been incredible because the roster situation that was left for him was awful. It might have been worse than what Leipold inherited at Kansas. And very quickly, Fisch built basically a new team through the transfer portal and high school recruiting. And I think that second part's the key there. That 2022 class at Arizona is the cornerstone of the team that won 10 games this year. And they are looking, if he stays, if he doesn't get hired away, they are looking at having a very good season. They're very optimistic about 2024. So that's another one that can kind of go into the portal and get what you need, go to the high school ranks and get what you need. He's already shown he can recruit on the West Coast. I mean, most of that Arizona class that built this 10-win team is from the West Coast. Here's one I threw in here because he's in an interesting situation. So Eli Drinkwitz at Missouri, coming off a great year in 2023. They won 11 games. They're optimistic about next year, but they've got to replace some holes in the roster. They lost some really good players to the NFL. And here's the deal. Are you going to be able to do that every year in the SEC at Missouri? It's going to be hard when you look at the rest of the competition. If you were to go to Washington, which is moving into the Big Ten, could you be a top 3, top 4 team in the Big Ten most years? Yes, you can. And that's the key distinction. Because I think if you're in the SEC or the Big Ten, you have an outsized chance of getting to the playoff because the top 3 or 4 teams in each of those leagues every year are going to make the playoff. So it would be easier to do that in the Big Ten at Washington than it is in the SEC at Missouri. So if I'm Eli Drinkwitz, I think about this. Now, if I'm Troy Dannon, I'm not sure if that's where my mind is going immediately, but I imagine Eli's agent would make sure if Eli's interested that Troy would know. This is another name that if the Pac-12 would stay together, I would not be putting this name out there at all. But because it did, his job and the Washington job are now 2 different jobs when they used to be kind of similar. Kyle Whittingham at Utah. Now, Kyle Whittingham has very quietly been one of the best coaches in college football for the last 20 years. He took over for Urban Meyer starting with the 2005 season. Urban Meyer left for Florida. Whittingham got promoted. He's been phenomenal at Utah. And he's 64. Probably he's going to retire at Utah. But if he wants to go to a school where there's a better chance of competing for national titles, now would be the chance. Now would be the time. Because if you've ever met Kyle Whittingham, even though he's about to turn 65, he doesn't look or act like that. He looks and acts 10 years younger. So there's a good window here where potentially you could have a guy who's won a ton, who knows how to recruit the West Coast, who knows how to develop talent, especially along the line of scrimmage. I don't know that he'd do it, but I think it's worth an ask. Speaking of, I don't know if he'd do it, but I think it's worth an ask. If none of these other guys pan out, you call Chris Petersen. Chris Petersen, currently a Fox analyst, former Washington coach, former Boise State coach. I don't think Chris Petersen would want to deal with the NIL and transfer portal era. He was not a fan of that stuff when he was coaching Washington, but he's also the kind of guy who loves the place he worked. Washington was great to him. He was great to Washington. And maybe he has that itch. Who knows? But if you want a steady hand on the till as you move into the Big Ten, there are not many steadier hands than Chris Petersen. So we know he's Washington's kind of guy. But again, I don't know if he wants to deal with all the new stuff in college football. So you might want to go with some of the guys I had a little higher on that list. But Troy Dannon, this is your first real big act as the Washington AD. You got some options. Thank you so much for watching. Just a reminder, subscribe to this channel right here so you never miss an episode of Andy Staples on 3. And oh, by the way, watch all the other great videos on the On3 Sports YouTube channel.